Hello, everyone, and welcome. This is part two of the French generals of World War One. So we're going to be looking at 20 more commanders who commanded at least an army. As with the first list, some of them are a little bit more important than others. Some of them actually had army groups. Some of them took part in strategy, and others of them just commanded an army once or twice, and we're not going to really say that much about them. So joining me tonight is Sean Chick. So Sean, how you been, man? Sean?
Oh, I'm just a bit tired right now. How about yourself?
I'm doing okay, I guess. I'm just happy my Wi-Fi is working tonight.
Hear me?
So, yeah, I had to fix it again, and
Going on here?
you were breaking up for just a minute, but you're
You're
fine now.
just, but you hear me fine
Yeah, I can hear you
right
fine
now.
now. It was acting weird for a second, but it's cool now.
Fine now. Okay, good, good, good.
Yeah, it just got off to like when you were saying you were sleepy. It was like, sleepy.
Okay, good, good.
So, yeah, it was kind of like a good effect that we worked in there. So, all right, so we have some interesting
Yeah,
figures to explore
yeah.
tonight. So obviously the French war effort was a very hard fought battle. They took immense casualties, as we mentioned last time. It also took them a very long time to
Oh,
get their
nice,
armaments
nice.
industry up to snuff.
Yeah, I don't tend to.
Do what?
Mm-hmm.
All
No,
right.
what's up?
Also, okay. So it took them a long time to get their war industry up to snuff, and so what we're going to do is look at the generals who are a little bit later for the most part, although we still have some early war guys, and we will be looking at two of the heaviest hitters of them all up first. So I made you guys wait till part two to get Petain and Foch, but now you're getting them. So we'll start off with Philippe Petain, the most famous and probably most controversial of the French generals. So obviously, we're not going to talk about his
Only
post-war
controversy
career.
because it happens after the war.
Yes,
Yeah, the controversy of him is really just it's after the war.
he's the perfect example of if he had
You
just
know.
had the good sense to die right after the war, he would be very popular today. Or even if hell, if he had
Yeah,
died like
probably so.
1939 or something, he would still be remembered really well. But Petain was born as a peasant. That's actually not uncommon. The French army had become relatively egalitarian by the time of the Third Republic. He's born in 1856, and his rise will not be at all fast or meteoric. He's also not really a star in any way. So some of the guys we talked about have been stars who had a moment early in their career that kind of marked them out. That is not the case with Petain. He will have a pretty well respected intellect, though, and he's a good lecturer at the War College, but he is just out of step with the cult of the offensive idea. So he's not popular with most of his fellow officers, although he does have some friends in the firepower school. He's also a conservative Catholic, which was kind of a bit of a holdback to his career. I think sometimes it gets exaggerated in the literature because actually a hell of a lot of these guys are that, and they still manage to make it. So it's like a supposed handicap that didn't prevent like 10 people from making it. So it can't be that bad. But he doesn't have the charm of someone like Castleknoe, who was always very funny. So he could be a bit of a dick sometimes, which is pretty common. Also, Foch was a dick, as we'll see. So again, not too much of a boundary. And he also didn't play politics, so Petain has no friends in Paris. So if you just look at his pre-war record, there would be no reason to think this man is ever going to be commander in chief. It's also interesting his personal life was also a mess. He actually was a womanizer until his 40s, and he fell in love with a much younger woman, and she rejected him on the grounds that the artist who was also dating her would have better life prospects. So she wouldn't go out with Petain because she thought he wasn't going to rise high enough, and she instead decided to go with an artist. So talk about a reversal of the norm here. Later on, he will actually marry her after she gets divorced in the middle of the war, and now he's a national hero. But they'll never be happy because Petain always feels rejected. So even as he's winning this great fame in the war, he's always going to be a little bit resentful that his wife basically used him as the backup plan. And he also hates his stepson, who will become a famous movie director, but that's a different story for a different time. Anyway, by 1914, he's getting sick and tired of being passed over for promotion. He's really strongly considering retirement in the near future. Then the war breaks out, he gets a brigade, and despite not being very popular, he does really well, so people start promoting him. And despite the fact that a lot of the guys in high command don't like his ideas, they can't deny that he's successful. So he commands a division by the time of the Marne, so a month in, he's already up a level. Then he gets a corps by the time we get to spring 1915 at Artois. And finally, by July of 1915, he's already got Second Army in the Verdun sector. But before that, he even led it in the Champagne offensive, and now it gets settled at Verdun, which is kind of or actually no, he won't be at Verdun yet. Sorry. He's known as a good commander, but he's on leave, and he's actually now with his wife at a hotel in Paris. And then a messenger arrives. He's being summoned to Verdun, so he's being called upon to go to Verdun. They need a skilled commander there. So he takes up Second Army, and now he's going to be the commander-in-chief in probably the decisive battle for the French, at least. And this will be his moment to become a hero. He does everything from organized logistics to figure out how to hold the line. He really proves himself, becomes a national hero. This is when that famous "They shall not pass" line is spoken, which was actually Nivelle, but it gets attributed to Petain. And Nivelle worked under Petain, so it kind of makes sense. Petain will also start doing the rotation system, so he knows men get worn out, so you need to rotate them in and out of the lines. So he has a much better understanding of morale than most people. And of course, he also understands the importance of firepower. So he predicted before the war, yeah, you need firepower to win. You're not going to be able to win with just spirit. He organizes taxis to run supplies. He does a lot of things that are legendary. Well, what ends his career at Verdun, at least temporarily? Well, Joffre is jealous. And we talked about Joffre last time being the ultimate army politician. So Joffre actually promotes Petain to get him out of the way and to make sure that he won't be able to get all the credit. So he promotes him to army group, makes another man retire, and then puts Nivelle in place of Petain, so that way Nivelle will get some of the glory for Verdun. And so, we all know how that story goes from last time. Nivelle will then get the nod later to become the new commander-in-chief after Joffre continues to falter, especially at the Somme. Nivelle launches his offensive that breaks the army's morale, and who do they turn to fix things? Petain. So Petain will be the guy who really now starts increasing wine rations. He'll start doing a lot of things to promote better morale and unity. He also will promote training in the rear areas for the first time. So training and tactics and everything else. And the army's morale will be restored. They'll start fighting well again. But then we get to a little bit of the controversy in terms of his generalship. So Petain is a fantastic commander, either tactically or defensively. But one thing that he is not very good at, unfortunately, is coordinated attacks with the British. And also just large-scale offensives, because he's very casualty conscious. He's still convinced that French morale might collapse. In fact, during the early Ludendorff offensives, he and some of his staffers are actually saying, France is doomed. We can't win. We should start doing peace talks right now. So this is partly why Foch will become commander-in-chief of the Allies rather than Petain. And he also will butt heads a lot with Haig, and he'll butt heads a lot with Foch once Foch is appointed over him. But of course, the war will come to a successful conclusion, and Petain will always be judicious in terms of moving troops around and doing all the tasks of an army commander-in-chief. So again, tactically, a fantastic commander. But when it comes to certain elements of strategy, he's surprisingly lacking, given how brilliant he is at other things. So what do you think about Philippe Petain, Sean?
Sorry, 1 second here. Okay. Petain's probably easily one of your most impressive commanders in the First World War. You're right about maybe him not having the best grasp of strategy, but in some ways, I think what a lot of generals in World War One need more than that, honestly, is better tactics. You know, because of how terrible the tactical stalemate is on the Western Front. It's impressive that he's able to rise at all, considering his taciturn personality and things that be held against him. One of the things I found most interesting was his take on firepower. And a lot of that's what I mentioned is that one of the things that struck me is that he was against the cult of the offensive and Elan. And he wrote, and a lot of things is the people into that were drawing a lot from the Napoleonic Wars and saying that's how Napoleon, how the French army was successful. Petain made his own study of Napoleon and said, no, it was all about firepower. And I agree with him in my own studies of Napoleonic Wars, is that while, and then maybe now you could maybe make a case that there's kind of a balance between the two. The French army definitely was good at quick marches and on the offensive, but Napoleon did emphasize firepower with massed artillery that could be brought quickly to bear.
Right.
You know,
And I mean,
and
Napoleon
French artillery
famously was
is
an
the best
artillery
art.
guy.
Right, and French artillery is the best artillery of the Napoleonic Wars. The only one comparable in quality is Russian artillery. You know, in the case of the Russian artillery, it has to do with the fact they had heavy guns and skillful gunners, but the French definitely were able to move around their artillery more quickly. So I think as a commander for the French, he's probably the best they have in the First World War. Although I didn't know about him being that defeatist during the Ludendorff offensives. Book I read about him some years ago did not say that
Yeah.
necessarily.
Well, so
It did
because
say that he wasn't as optimistic
so it was bad enough that even
necessarily.
some of his friends thought he might actually get sacked altogether. And
Wow.
he didn't, but one of his chief of staff, who was a little more outspoken but was understood to be speaking for Petain, did get cashiered. I think we covered him last time, or maybe he's going
Oh,
to come up today. But anyway, yeah. So it was a pretty serious rebuke from Paris, and it's kind of like, Petain, shut the fuck up. We're gonna let you keep your job because you're the hero of Verdun, but you really need to shut your mouth.
yeah. Okay.
And actually, he loses. I think he loses. I think two chiefs of staff as a rebuke. So there actually was a fair amount of discontent with some of his performance as commander in chief. So even a lot of his allies wrote that he couldn't really do the job in certain aspects.
But I know some of that has to do with, like you said, not very good at coordinating with the British, and there's definitely Anglophobia going through Britain that of course other French generals have it, but it's particularly heavy with him, and that's going to play a big part in his actions in World War II, of course, as well. You know,
Yeah, and I mean, of course, his
but yeah, like I said, we're not.
yeah, yeah. The other
But like I
negative,
said, like I'm sorry, no. What I was going to say is that we're not here to get into his World War II career.
right,
You
which is
know,
just depressing and also
yeah,
not very interesting, frankly. But his
yeah. I don't know about not very interesting, but it sure is depressing.
Yeah, actually, I was thinking about it as if we were looking for a short stream topic. Actually, Petain post-war might actually be kind of interesting. Not only the Vichy France stuff, but also his influence on French tactics going into World War II, because he actually did a lot of damage after the war. So he kind of did a Wellington, where his influence on the army after he was a general was pretty much all in negative.
The French army did very well in the 1920s in the military engagements it was called to be in. And Petain definitely, one thing just say real quick for his post World War One stuff is that he was definitely not somebody who was not emphasizing tanks or the offensive. You know, it's just that the French and the British army as well, in many cases, are going into World War Two with a World War One tank mindset because that's what worked for them in that war.
Yeah.
Not realizing they're fighting an opponent who has improved upon those tactics.
Yeah, but the problem with Petain is
You
that
know,
not only did he advocate for the infantry support role, but because he was so prestigious and he'd been proven right so many times in World War One, that's kind of what decided the debate for the French tank tactics. Well, I mean, Petain says so. I mean, he's kind of a prophet. We know this guy knows his shit.
but also, yeah, and it had worked in for the First World War and in North Africa. And I'll say this though for the French tank tactics of World War II, their tank tactics are better than the British ones. The British ones are like essentially treating tanks as cavalry, where they just charge in almost on their own.
Yeah, the
That's completely
unsupported
harebrained.
attacks. Yeah, those did not go well. I guess the only design they had that could
Yeah,
kind
I
of do
mean,
that a little bit was the Matilda, just because it was built to take a beating.
yeah. And then once the Germans have once they face anything that can take on a Matilda, I mean, it's really bad. So I would say that when you go into World War II, I actually think the British of all the major countries might have the worst tank tactics out of all of them. As
I
bad as
agree.
the I say bad as the French are. Bad as the French are, I think the French were probably closer to the mark, but they had other problems too, like a lack of radios in their tanks and whatnot. So at any rate, though, but once again, not getting too much into World War II, Petain. But no, at First World War, I mean, this is France's best commander.
Yeah. So I guess the question is, do we think he actually rates an S, or do his flaws take him down a tier?
I honestly go with S.
Okay. Yeah, I
That's
mean,
just my take. Now, I've kind of fallen a little bit out of favor with some of the ranking stuff. Um, you know, uh, for one thing, I ran into a thing on the Civil War forums where they were mentioning one of the rankings we did for Union generals. You know, and them being Civil War historians, all they do is nitpick and never listen to evidence because that's what they do, right? But I tried to explain like what the thinking was, and they just weren't having any of it. You know, so I don't know. I mean, I guess maybe you could bring him down a ranking. He could go either way. It's just that the tactics, his tactics in World War One so are so sound, right? And I can't think of another French general who is going to be tactically as good as him at that level.
yeah, I mean, I
You know,
think you're right, because I
and
mean,
in addition,
for all the failures he did have, the successes he had literally saved the country. So,
yeah,
but I mean, at the same
and
time, he'd
yeah,
been
and
fully empowered
once
here to fuck the country. So it's like it's a very difficult ranking, I guess. Patan kind of fucks over the ranking system in some ways.
I think a lot of stuff with building up French morale is big as well because Verdun, of course, is big, but I think the bigger one is what he's able to do with the French army after the mutiny.
Right.
That's a much more difficult situation.
Yeah. No, he does. That is a hard one, and he handles it really well. Actually, I think that earns him the S, because now I think about it, a lot of the other guys who might have been commander in chief, their ideas for how to handle it were barbaric and would have failed, like Cadorna style shit. So they were just saying,
Yeah, that's the
just
thing
start
too.
shooting
Like a
guys.
lot of yeah, there's a tendency in World War One, an army's morale cracks like that for the country to lose. The French just don't. You know.
Well, also I've read that a
Yeah.
lot of people think that the morale crisis wasn't as bad as it's sometimes portrayed, and that a lot of the senior commanders thought it was way worse than it really was. It might have been a little bit more isolated,
Hmm.
but I don't know. Uh,
I've read the opposite. It was much more pervasive than some people thought it was.
oh, really?
Uh, so yeah, it seemed pretty pervasive to me in my readings.
Oh, okay.
There's always going to be somebody though who says, "Oh, this wasn't that big of a deal," you know. I mean, except for something like maybe like Stalingrad or Vicksburg, right? But I mean, hell, they got books that'll tell you that Midway wasn't that big of a deal. I've read them.
All right. Well, our next commander is another. I guess at one point he'd have been a household name, Ferdinand Foch. So,
Not only a
Foch.
household name, he's got a street named. Hey, he's got a street named after him in New Orleans.
Yeah. Also, I forgot to mention with
He does.
Petain, the last street named after him in France already just got renamed recently. So he no longer has a single street named for him in France.
Well, I mean, that's just further sign of the French are a joke. But please continue.
Well, I mean, also he picked the wrong side in the war where he really didn't want to pick the wrong side. But uh, anyway, with Foch,
Yeah, whatever. Oh, yeah, it was. I mean, hey, if the streets near Verdun, it should be named after Petain. Simple as that.
yeah, maybe they can rename it after his mistress or something. Just be indirect about it. Uh, anyway, Foch was from southwestern
Guess I'm just
France.
tired of moral grand. I guess I'm tired of moral grandstanding from warmongering morons, which is what I get nowadays. So that's just my take.
Same here, but I mean, they tend to get to name everything. So, so with Foch, he's from the
Yeah, much
southwest of
to the detriment of us.
yeah, from the southwest of France. He was born in 1851, and his family's also devoutly Catholic. Although I don't think he was super religious as an adult, so that kind of helps him a little bit. As a young man, he will serve in the Franco-Prussian War, but he actually doesn't make it into combat because the war ends too fast. He will then go into the Polytechnic School, so he studies artillery. But most of his experience as an officer is actually in staff work, which will actually become extremely important because we need somebody who can actually run the army and understands the big picture, and that's what Foch's strength was. He's also pretty intelligent. He was known for being a bit short, although some of the pictures I've seen make him look not that short, but apparently he was considered short by his contemporaries. But he was extremely forceful and almost to the point of being a bully. So he was kind of an intellectual bully in the sense that if he thought you were wrong, he would berate you and badger you until you agreed with him. And he also tended to get worked up and really gesticulate wildly, and could sometimes become difficult to understand, which is actually similar to Haig and Robertson, interestingly enough. And he was also...
So he'd make a great Civil War historian.
Yes, so he'd be good at one of those round tables yelling about how brilliant Jackson's Valley campaign actually was, or whatever people debate.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, he also wanted in general to have free and open debate, so his idea of what a debate is much more vigorous than most people's. And he wanted junior officers to speak up, so he was really into that debate culture more so than most officers. And he would often say, to hell with protocol. He also was very by the book. He liked to eat dinner every single day at the same exact time, no exceptions. And he pretty much worked every goddamn minute of the day, every single day. So he's not a guy who takes a minute off, he doesn't take breaks, doesn't take days off, and he expects the same of everybody around him, so he can be deeply exhausting. He also will be a renowned instructor, and he is a big interpreter of Napoleon. Obviously, he has a very different version of Napoleon than Petain. He's more of the Elan school, and while he's not the originator of Cult of the Offensive, he's pretty much the major pusher, because again, he is this forceful, fairly charismatic presence. That being said, usually the people who are the most wrong are people who have to have a certain amount of intelligence to be that wrong. And Foch is a good example of that. So before the war, he actually does quite a bit of damage before a single shot is fired. So back in 1910, he tried to poo-poo the importance of air power, and he said that it's a mere sport, and it would never amount to anything. He also said heavy artillery was a waste of time. He said it's too slow, and because we need to attack rapidly, and heavy artillery is useless because it takes too long to get to the front lines. So don't bother developing it. And people took him very seriously. So that's partly why the French will be so short on heavy artillery until like the last year or two of the war. And so he does real damage. I want to make that clear before a shot's fired. That being said, he does learn. So by 1917, he's abandoned his earlier devotion to the cult of the offensive, and he's developed methodical warfare, which is basically the British version of the French version of the British bite and hold. And he also will fall out with Joffre after years of being good friends. So I'm not going to go through his career in super detail because he's like everywhere all the time. So he's not like one of those guys we can actually cover every detail of. I think overall he is overrated. Now he is genuinely smart. He's forceful. He shows improvement. He corrects previous mistakes. And he's okay at picking subordinates. He's not great at it, but he's okay. And he's the harshest taskmaster in a world where all these guys were harsh. One of his most famous incidents we talked about last video with another general is a general was freaking out, and Foch took him in a side room and said, here are your options. Attack, retreat, or fuck off. I forbid the third, so choose one of the other two. Or no, attack, defend, or fuck off. That's how it went. He's also very... yeah, that's a great quote. I mean... But apparently he thought he was being respectful of taking this guy into his side room, but he said it so loud that everybody there heard it. And it ruined that guy's career, by the way. Because after that, nobody took him seriously after, Foch unmanned him in that way. He's very good at army politics, and by the war's end, only Petain and a few others were where they were without Foch's endorsement. So most of the army officers by the end are Foch allies. Except for Petain and like 2 or 3 of his friends. He's also dogmatic, but despite being super dogmatic, he's actually pretty good at working with the So he can do one thing that Petain can't. So he commands Northern Army Group for 2 years. He's pretty good at it just because he can get along with the Brits. Yet, all the attacks he helps take part in, it's worth noting, all those attacks the British are known for that he helps with, pretty much all fail. So, for the people who say Foch is a great genius, I would ask for examples on the field. After the attacks on the Somme, where he's in direct command, he gets relieved, so he's kind of out of the picture for a while. Then politicians appointed Nivelle. When Nivelle fails, that's when Foch makes his comeback. And had Nivelle not failed, or failed less, and the mutinies hadn't happened, there's a good chance that Petain still takes command overall, and then Foch is kind of sidelined for the rest of the war. But because of the failure of Nivelle, they're bringing back anybody who's shown talent before. And I have to say, rarely have I ever seen anyone get so much credit for being wrong about so many things when it comes to predictions, because Foch is a terrible predictor. In fact, if you ever wanted to do betting odds, ask Foch what he thinks will happen and then bet for the opposite, and you'll win money. That being said, he does have a big picture view of the war. He understood the need to integrate the Americans into the fight. He understood the need to work with the British and sometimes make sacrifices for them, whereas Petain always expected the British to take hits for the French. So he understood that there had to be give and take. That was something Petain could never process. And, yeah, it's interesting. He's controversial because at the time people thought he sucked as Allied Commander-in-Chief, but then over time, right now scholars are actually pretty warm when it comes to Foch. They think he's actually pretty good. That being said, I actually think contemporary opinion might be a little more accurate. I don't think he's terrible, and certainly he's not the worst we've seen by any stretch of the imagination. And obviously being a commander-in-chief in World War I was an immensely difficult task. But he's clearly a hell of a lot better than Joffre, Conrad, Cadorna. So I would say that in many ways, and maybe you can speak to this, I would say that he's kind of maybe a little bit better than someone like a Haig. And maybe he's kind of like on the U.S. Grant level a little bit, in the sense that he's got his high marks for certain things, but there are also some serious flaws in what he does.